India will almost completely cut its imports of Russian oil. This was reported by Bloomberg. This happened after the United States imposed new restrictions against the companies Rosneft and Lukoil. Executives of leading Indian refineries have already stated that the latest sanctions from Washington have effectively made it impossible to continue purchases. Victoria Chistyukina will continue on this topic.
Following Chinese companies, which suspended purchases of Russian oil after sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, Indian refineries are making a similar decision. The Indian corporation Reliance Industries has started actively purchasing oil from Middle Eastern countries and the United States, Bloomberg reports. The company has purchased several grades of oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Qatar, and the United States. Deliveries are scheduled for December and January.
A representative of Reliance stated that the company is currently assessing the impact of various sanctions on the flow of Russian oil and the export of petroleum products to Europe. A company representative stated that oil supply contracts will be adjusted in accordance with changes in market and regulatory conditions. From a Bloomberg publication.
Until recently, Reliance remained the largest importer of Russian oil in India, receiving crude under a long-term contract with Rosneft. However, after the imposition of sanctions, the company has been forced to seek new sources of supply. According to sources, in October, Reliance purchased at least 10 million barrels of oil on the spot market, mostly Middle Eastern grades. Most of the deals were concluded after the U.S. restrictions were imposed.
The role of the shadow fleet is increasing, and it is being increasingly financed by the Russian Federation, and specifically for the oil that arrives in India at the ship graveyard. In India, ships from the shadow fleet are being purchased. These are old vessels that still continue to operate at sea and in the Mediterranean region. Nevertheless, they deliver Russian oil, which is also supplied to Chinese ports. It is also delivered to the ports of New Delhi.
Since 2022, India has become the largest buyer of Russian oil delivered by sea at a discount. It imported about 1.7 million barrels per day over the course of 9 months in 2025. Analysts note that, against the backdrop of new sanctions, the flow of Russian oil to India may sharply decrease, except for supplies to Nayara Energy, which is partially controlled by Rosneft. At the same time, demand for Middle Eastern grades of oil is growing, which has already led to an increase in their prices. In October, India already reduced its imports of Russian crude by 50% after negotiations with the United States. Washington had been pressuring India for several months to stop buying Russian oil. In Talba,
India currently has 4 of the largest oil refineries, which are presently under the direct control of the Russian Federation. At these industrial enterprises, a significant 62% of shares are controlled by companies that are owned by Gazprom and the Russian Federation. The United States is currently taking major steps to prevent Russian oil from entering the pipeline.
Russia is already experiencing a gasoline shortage in many regions. The Federation is on the verge of an energy collapse. The Serbian oil company NIS, which is 55% owned by Gazprom and Gazprom Neft, may have to shut down the country's only oil refinery within a week, according to Reuters, citing sources familiar with the situation. Earlier, due to American sanctions, the Croatian operator JANAF, which manages the only oil pipeline supplying Serbia, ceased working with NIS. The Gazprom subsidiary supplies 80% of Serbia's gasoline and diesel needs, and more than 90% of its aviation kerosene and fuel oil.
To resolve the crisis in Serbia, representatives of Gazprom Neft, Alexander Dukov, and Russian Deputy Minister of Energy Pavel Sorokin flew to Serbia in mid-October. According to Večernje Novosti, Serbia proposed to buy out the Russian stake in NIS in order to remove the plant from under sanctions. The Russian side refused and stated that they would like to see a buyer. Someone else, for example, the United States, according to sources cited by the publication.
After the American leader increased pressure on Putin, the U.S. Senate wants to vote on a bill for large-scale sanctions against Russia. Donald Trump himself believes that the impact of American restrictions on Moscow can only be assessed in 6 months. At the same time, the European Union has also adopted its 19th package of sanctions against the Russian Federation. Starting January 1, 2027, a phased ban on the import of Russian LNG will come into effect. In addition, another 117 vessels have been added to the shadow fleet used to circumvent oil restrictions. Now their total number has reached 558. Victoria Chistyukhina for Freedom TV channel.
Andriy Zakrevsky, Deputy Director of the Association of Energy Natural Resources of Ukraine, is with us today. Andriy, welcome. We're glad to see you. Hello.
Good morning.
Wishing you good health, Leila. Wishing you good health, Andriy. Well, for the first time in a while, some good news, right? Good news? Really? Well, then let's go on. Well, indeed, yes, the news is wonderful. We really are lacking good news, aren't we? And that's the truth. But in Moscow, they're telling us that this isn't good news, that things aren't the way you describe them, and as Bloomberg and everyone else writes. Well, let's be constructive, as always. So will the flow of Russian oil to the leading Indian refinery drop almost to zero or not?
Of course, it will decrease, but not quickly. Well, the right tone if Trump supports it. But, he's good at rolling things back. I think he'll find basically the pace at which India will actually reduce the amount of Russian oil, but at the same time, it won't, for example, just move to the black market. Because if you push too hard, they'll simply go to the black market. That's all. And that's absolutely correct. Stanislav Ignatiev says that even if it's with old rust buckets, they'll still deliver that oil. But if you do it properly, that is, if you show alternatives, if the alternative prices aren't that much higher, then everything will be fine. I probably see the sequence of events over the last 10 days a bit differently. So I'll tell you how I see it. First, sanctions are being imposed regarding Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftgaz, but the Kremlin doesn't really take it seriously because, frankly, Gazprom Neft produces a lot compared to Ukraine, but not much compared to Russia as a whole. And as for Surgutneftgaz, well, whatever, its output is supplied to the domestic market. So Putin doesn't get the hint. And at that moment, the report for 2025 comes out, the financial year ends, and forecasts for 2026 are released, which say that they see prices, well, definitely, even for Brent, below $50. So not even $60, but below $50. And prices start to collapse. As soon as prices start to fall below $60, Trump sees an opportunity to impose additional sanctions under which industry won't suffer as much. The United States of America, but his oil companies and the oil companies of partners will continue to profit. And immediately, automatically, as soon as the price crosses the $60 threshold, automatically, even without any further action, a message appears on the US government websites stating that sanctions are being imposed against Gazprom and Rosneft and Lukoil as well. And these are currently the largest exporters of Russian oil. That's how I see these events unfolding. The fact that Putin simultaneously escalated militarily, that at that very moment there were strikes on Kharkiv, that children were harmed, this precisely underscores Putin's reaction and the West's silent response to the processes taking place. And for me, well, many have said that the strikes on Kharkiv led to this kind of silent response. But I think what we saw was evidence that Europeans and America support Ukraine, that some things have simply become reflexive. Two triggers were activated. First, the price of oil dropped low enough that there was no longer a fear of a sharp price spike due to a ban on Lukoil and Rosneft. And the second point, escalation of the conflict by Putin, plus the unwillingness to end the war and a slap in the face to an outstretched hand from Lavrov. These are the two triggers that automatically led to this result.
Andrei Anatolievich, how would you assess this? There was information that, in fact, President Trump imposed these sanctions after he was shown those horrific images from Kharkiv, when a kindergarten was hit and children were being evacuated from there. And in fact, that's when Trump wavered. By and large, we are really seeing an intensification of terrorist activity, an increase in shelling. This will surely be shown to Trump as well.
Yes, indeed. There was also a publication in Bloomberg, which had a significant influence on Trump and Rubio, prompting him to make this decision. I don't know what actually influenced him there, but nevertheless, the shelling should make an impression on the President of the United States. Well, for these kinds of results to appear, as the Moscow Times wrote about the day before, shares of Rosneft and Lukoil have already plummeted by more than 5 billion after the United States imposed sanctions. By the way, Actually, what will the Russian Federation do when people stop buying its oil and gas? Well, it's true this won't happen tomorrow, but still. They're not just going to shut off the tap, are they? Just yesterday, our whole production team was discussing how this would play out. Where are they going to put all that oil they're sitting on and the gas too? Unfortunately, at first, thank you, they'll simply offer huge discounts to the buyers. They still have those who aren't afraid of sanctions from the United States of America. But not everything depends entirely on the United States of America. If there are no secondary sanctions, this is also a very important point, then in principle, direct sanctions from both the European Union and the United States only affect about 60% of the world. There are 36% of the world that quite simply do not interact directly either with the European Union, the Commonwealth of Economic Development countries, or with the United States of America. They interact only indirectly. On one of our broadcasts this week, I pointed out that China will be the first pioneer to say yes and will immediately declare that the sanctions will not be enforced by China. And we even argued a bit about whether this would happen or not. But as you can see, the information from China was immediately unambiguous. Why? Because China is very deeply and thoroughly integrated into the global economy. So for China, the impact of sanctions is direct and immediate. But India, no, India, it's actually considered one of the non-aligned African countries. It works with a huge number of different countries, the Asian basin, African countries that have not joined in, and for whom these sanctions do not have a direct impact. Yes, right now the main point of pressure on India exists. Look, even in Reuters reports, it's that they are reconsidering their exports. In essence, it's the re-export of Russian oil to Europe. That is when Russian oil processed at Indian refineries suddenly becomes Indian. But this is what affects them. This is the part they've announced. But at the same time, to say that they will completely abandon it, I wouldn't rush to say that right now. So only secondary sanctions imposed on India could bring it down to zero. And the pace that's being set now, it should be, well, I estimate it will take about 1.5 to 2 years. That's before all of this happens. Another point, this morning I was conducting another study. This card, I think, will be played by Trump in about 6 months. If you want, I'd like to make a prediction for the first time on your show. I think the next card on the table will be designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. This idea already came up at the time of the initial invasion. And we're coming back to the question of escalation from Trump's side. And did the death of the children in Kharkiv influence this? Of course it did. I think this is one of those moments that showed Trump what kind of wolf he's dealing with and what kind of boundaries need to be set for him. Because Trump doesn't hide the fact that his wife reached out to the Russian president and it was all about the children. The core of Trump's electorate is the Republicans. Republicans don't just treat family values with the utmost respect. They see them as fundamental. First, help your family, then help your neighbor, then build your country. And this is a slap in the outstretched hand, not only from Rubio, not only from Lavrov, but also a slap from Putin towards Trump's wife. This is a demonstration of what Putin is doing. This is the unmasking in relation to Trump. And we saw a poker face. So I think first there was this news release and only then did Trump comment. This is exactly a sign that now, well, his attitude toward Putin's words, and by the way, Putin's word itself, that's it, it's over.
Andriy Anatolievich, what is your forecast? Well, look, yes, there was a strike the day before on the Ryazan oil refinery. One of the 4 largest friendly Ukrainian drones hit it. It's well known, and today on air we discussed the fact that basically the Russian defense industry is now limping on both legs. What is your forecast? Basically, the defense industry today survives mainly on the money provided by the trade in Russian energy resources. If this trade decreases, when will it all come to a halt?
Probably in about 20 years then. If you make that the main focus, then Syria, Iran, Venezuela, after those, well, Venezuela, the whole story has been going on for a huge number of years. No, that's not something worth paying attention to. Here, it's more important to pay attention to Ukraine's capabilities. You understand that this week we met Russia head on only now. If we met in 2014, when Ukraine's economy was plummeting and Russia's economy was on the rise after the oil crisis, in other words, Russia's economy was moving forward successfully, their funds were being filled, and so on and so forth, while we were stagnating and ended up in such a situation that by 2014, 60% of Ukraine's banking system belonged to Russian citizens. We tend to forget about that. What path? What path has Ukraine traveled over the past 10 years? We shouldn't forget about that. And now we meet on Ukraine's opposite course. Right now, the national bank's key rate is 15.5%. And in Russia, the national bank's key rate is 16.5%. But there are nuances. You see, it's like in that joke. That is, Ukraine is now developing its military complex, and Russia is developing its own military complex. But there are nuances. Who are Ukraine's partners? What goals are we setting for ourselves in the military sector? Where are we locating our production facilities? Military ones? We are placing our chemical plants in the United States of America. We are setting up our training centers in the Baltic countries. In Northern Europe, we are among the richest in everything imaginable. We're thinking setting up drone workshops and training people. Our children are studying in England. In other words, our military personnel are being trained in America at West Point. Is there a difference in the opposing courses when we met again in this war? And going forward, the situation will get much more interesting.
Well, Andriy Anatolievich, thank you for your optimism. Thank you for the good news and for always communicating with us. Andriy Zakrevsky, Deputy Director of the Association of Energy and Natural Resources of Ukraine, was with us today. Well, we talked about how India might act in the near future regarding Russian oil. And now let's also remind ourselves about Lukoil. The president of Lithuania is now urging EU leaders to include the country's oil giant Lukoil in the 20th package of EU sanctions against Russia. President of Lithuania Gitanas Nausėda, this was reported by LRT, he reminded that the US has already imposed restrictions targeting the two largest Russian oil companies. The sanctions provide for the freezing of all assets of Rosneft and Lukoil. In the US, there is also a ban on all American companies conducting any business with these Russian
companies. Lukoil is not included in the 19th European sanctions package. Now we are starting discussions on the 20th sanctions package. I asked, how long are we going to consider Lukoil a sacred cow, and why can't we include this company in the package of restrictions? This would really deal a significant blow to the Russian economy, which is already barely standing on its feet. Gitanas Nausėda, president of Lithuania, in an interview with LRT,